For months, the world has been asking one question: what is really happening behind closed doors with Sean Diddy Combs? Now, according to multiple sources close to 50 Cent, that answer may have finally surfaced in the form of prison tapes that were never meant to be released. Because after 50 Cent allegedly dropped those prison recordings connected to Diddy, the internet didn't just react, it exploded. And suddenly, one thing became clear. This may not just be another controversy. This could be the moment Diddy's entire career begins to collapse. And when 50 Cent later sat down to discuss his Netflix docuseries, Sean Combs, The Reckoning, he made something even more unsettling clear: what the public has seen so far may only be the beginning. According to him, there are more tapes. And if they're released, everything changes. What makes this moment feel different is the tone surrounding these alleged recordings. This isn't about flashy headlines or social media jokes anymore. The way insiders describe the audio paints a picture of a man under extreme pressure, isolated, emotionally overwhelmed, and allegedly sounding nothing like the untouchable mogul the world once knew. Not confident, not in control, but shaken. And when a figure as powerful as Diddy is framed this way, public perception begins to shift fast. For years, Diddy's image was built on dominance, power moves, industry silence, and influence that extended far beyond music. But prison walls have a way of stripping power down to its rawest form. According to sources familiar with the situation, the alleged tapes don't just reveal stress, they reveal fear. Fear of betrayal, fear of abandonment, fear that the system he once navigated so effortlessly may no longer protect him. And then there's 50 Cent. This is not a random celebrity chiming in. This is someone who has documented this downfall almost step by step, reposting headlines, highlighting inconsistencies, and framing everything as a long overdue reckoning. When someone with 50's history, resources, and media instinct starts hinting that he's holding more material that's not entertainment, that's leverage. At this point, the biggest question isn't even whether the tapes are real. It's why this narrative is being allowed to breathe. In high-profile situations like this, the standard response is immediate denial, aggressive legal threats, or strategic counterleaks. But instead, there's been a noticeable pause. A silence that many believe is louder than any statement. And silence, in moments like these, often signals one thing: damage control happening behind the scenes. If you're watching this unfold in real time, now is the moment to pay attention. Because stories like this don't collapse all at once, they unravel. Layer by layer, leak by leak, reaction by reaction. And once public trust starts to crack, it rarely repairs itself. Before we go any further, I want to ask you directly: if more tapes are released, do you think they'll change everything? Or is this already past the point of no return? Drop your thoughts in the comments and make sure you subscribe to The Hidden Evidence, because this story is moving fast, and we're documenting every step. What adds another layer of intensity is the timing. These allegations are surfacing while public scrutiny is already at an all-time high. Lawsuits, industry silence, former allies distancing themselves, and now, alleged prison audio that humanizes Diddy in the most vulnerable way possible. For some, it sparks sympathy. For others, it confirms what they believe has been hidden for years. And here's the uncomfortable truth. When powerful figures begin to sound desperate, it usually means the consequences are no longer theoretical. Something is already in motion. Whether it's legal pressure, internal cooperation, or evidence moving through the system, desperation doesn't appear out of nowhere. It's a response. As this narrative continues to unfold, one thing is clear. The story is no longer about rumors, it's about control. Control of the timeline, control of public perception, and control of what gets exposed next. If 50 Cent truly holds more material, then this isn't the end of the story, it's the setup. Because once the first tape changes the conversation, every tape after that rewrites history. What happens next is where this story stops being entertainment and starts feeling dangerous. Because once the idea of prison tapes entered the public consciousness, people began asking questions they hadn't dared to ask before. Not about headlines, not about social media jokes, but about what pressure really looks like when the walls close in and the power structure disappears. Behind bars, status doesn't move the same way. influence doesn't travel instantly, and loyalty becomes something you question every single day. According to people familiar with how situations like this unfold, prison calls are often the most revealing moments in a powerful person's life, not because they're scripted, but because they're unguarded. There's no boardroom, no legal team whispering in your ear, just a phone line, limited time, and the weight of consequences. And that's why these alleged recordings have landed so hard. Not because of what was supposedly said word for word, but because of what they represent. Vulnerability, isolation, a man realizing that the world he once controlled is now moving without him. What's especially unsettling is how the industry has responded, or more accurately, how it hasn't. The same voices that once defended, collaborated, and stood shoulder to shoulder are suddenly quiet. No statements, no public support, no aggressive pushback. In Hollywood and the music industry, silence is rarely accidental. It's often a sign that people are waiting to see what surfaces next before choosing a side. And this is where the Netflix connection becomes critical. The Reckoning wasn't just a documentary, it was a narrative shift. It reframed years of whispers, lawsuits, and allegations into a single, digestible story that reached millions of homes. Once that framing exists, every new development gets filtered through it. Every alleged tape, every leaked detail, every pause in response. People close to the situation say this is when pressure compounds, when legal stress meets public judgment, when private fear becomes public spectacle. And when someone starts sounding emotional on recorded lines, it's often because they're processing more than the public knows. Court dates, evidence, cooperation, or the realization that protection has limits. There's also the question no one wants to ask out loud: why hasn't this been shut down yet? Powerful figures usually move fast when narratives turn against them. Cease and desist letters, emergency statements, strategic interviews. But here, the response has been measured. Careful, almost restrained. And that restraint has only fueled speculation that this situation is being handled with extreme caution because the stakes are far higher than image. Insiders have long said that the most dangerous phase of any downfall isn't the accusation phase, it's the documentation phase. When stories stop being dismissed as rumors and start being preserved as records, audio, timelines, witness accounts, cultural memory. Once that happens, even acquittals don't erase perception. The damage becomes permanent. And 50 Cent understands that better than most. He's not reacting emotionally, he's positioning, releasing just enough to keep attention locked, while hinting that the full scope hasn't surfaced yet. That kind of strategy isn't impulsive, it's intentional, and intention suggests preparation. As this unfolds, you can feel the tone changing. The jokes are fading, the memes are slowing down. What's replacing them is unease. Because people sense that this story isn't heading toward a dramatic apology or a clean resolution. It's heading toward something heavier, something official, something that doesn't get handled on Instagram. The uncomfortable reality is this: careers don't end when the public gets angry. They end when systems move. And systems move quietly at first, through sealed documents, through private cooperation, through moments the public never sees until it's too late to spin. If these alleged tapes are even partially real, they may not be the most damaging part of this story. They may simply be the signal, the moment when everyone realizes the narrative has already escaped its creator's control. Because once the world hears vulnerability where there was once dominance, the illusion breaks. And illusions, once broken, never come back together the same way. At this stage, the most revealing detail isn't what's been released, it's what hasn't. Because when a story reaches this level and still feels incomplete, it usually means the most consequential pieces are being handled off camera, quietly, methodically, away from public reaction. And that's often the moment when people closest to the situation begin making decisions that change everything. Sources familiar with high-profile legal collapses say this phase is the loneliest. Phones stop ringing. Allies stop checking in. Conversations become shorter, colder, more cautious. Not because people suddenly lose empathy, but because everyone is protecting themselves. Distance becomes survival, and the realization that loyalty has an expiration date hits harder than any headline. What's haunting about this moment is how irreversible it feels. Once the image cracks, it doesn't matter how much influence someone once had. The industry doesn't move on morality, it moves on risk. And right now, risk is the word hanging over everything. Collaborations freeze, invitations disappear, deals quietly dissolve, not announced, just gone. There's also a psychological weight that comes with watching your story be told without you. When documentaries, commentary, and alleged recordings start defining the narrative, control slips away fast. You're no longer shaping perception, you're reacting to it. And reaction is always weaker than creation. People who've watched powerful figures fall say the hardest moment isn't arrest or accusation. It's the moment they realize the machine that once protected them has shifted priorities. That preservation is no longer guaranteed, that the system doesn't owe anyone silence. And here's where the public misunderstands what's happening. This isn't chaos, it's organization. This is what accountability looks like before it becomes official. The slow tightening, the quiet alignment, the moment when every move is calculated because every mistake could accelerate consequences. If more material exists, audio, documentation, testimony, it won't be released recklessly. It will surface when it serves a purpose. When timing maximizes impact, when response options are limited, that's how these stories end, not with explosions, but with confirmations. And when that final confirmation arrives, people will look back at this moment and realize this was the turning point. Not the loudest moment, not the most dramatic, but the moment when silence replaced denial, when hesitation replaced confidence, when power stopped speaking and the record started speaking for it. Because in the end, reputations aren't destroyed by one tape or one documentary. They collapse when the truth no longer needs defending. When the story stands on its own, when the world stops asking what's happening behind closed doors, because the answer becomes impossible to ignore. And once that happens, there's no release left that can change the outcome. Only history being written in real time. What makes this final stretch so unsettling is the feeling that the ending has already been decided, just not announced yet. When a story reaches this level of quiet intensity, it's no longer about proving anything. It's about waiting. Waiting for the moment when private decisions turn public and consequences that have been building in silence finally step into the light. There's a pattern to how these moments end, and it rarely looks dramatic from the outside. No sudden confession, no cinematic showdown. Instead, it's paperwork, closed-door meetings, carefully worded statements that say just enough and nothing more. The real action happens where cameras aren't allowed, where timelines are finalized and outcomes are locked in long before the public catches up. What's chilling is how quickly the world adapts once that shift happens. The same platforms that once amplified power begin amplifying absence. Mentions slow down, references disappear, a name that once dominated conversation starts to feel oddly distant, like something from another era. Not erased, archived, and that's when reality settles in. Not just for the person at the center of the story, but for everyone watching. Because this isn't just about one figure, it's about what happens when influence meets accountability and loses. It's about the moment culture realizes that legacy isn't permanent, it's conditional. Those who've studied public collapses say the most painful part isn't losing status. It's watching the future you assumed was guaranteed quietly vanish. Projects that will never launch. Conversations that will never happen. Rooms you'll never walk into again. Not because you're banned, but because you're no longer relevant to the direction things are moving. And yet, the story doesn't end with anger. It ends with clarity. With the understanding that power without trust is temporary, and silence is never empty. It's full of decisions being made. When this chapter finally closes, people will debate timelines and blame and who knew what when. But the truth will be simpler. This was the moment when control slipped away for good. When the narrative stopped being managed and started being recorded. And long after the final updates fade, this period will be remembered not for the noise, but for the pause right before the outcome. The stretch where everyone felt it coming, even if no one said it out loud. Because some endings don't need a final tape, or a final headline, or a final statement. They arrive quietly, and once they do, there's no going back. By the time the dust finally settles, what remains won't be shock, it will be reflection. Because moments like this force culture to look at itself, not just the individual at the center of the storm. They make people ask how power was built, how it was protected, and why warning signs were ignored for so long. And those questions don't fade when the headlines do. They linger. There's a strange stillness that follows stories like this. A pause where everyone recalibrates. Artists rethink alliances. Executives rethink risk. Audiences rethink who they believed in and why. The myth of permanence breaks, and in its place comes something colder but more honest, the understanding that no one is untouchable, no matter how long they stood at the top. What history shows us is that downfall isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, almost respectful, as if the world collectively agrees to stop pretending. The narrative doesn't need to be pushed anymore because it's already settled into public memory. And once that happens, redemption isn't about denial, it's about time. Long stretches of silence, absence from relevance, a slow fading from the center of the conversation. And for those watching closely, this story becomes a warning more than a spectacle. A reminder that influence without accountability creates pressure, and pressure always looks for a way out. Sometimes through courts, sometimes through documents, sometimes through voices recorded in moments never meant to be heard. Years from now, people won't remember every detail of how this unfolded. They'll remember how it felt, the shift, the moment when confidence turned into caution and dominance turned into distance. They'll remember when the narrative stopped asking questions and started reaching conclusions. Because in the end, legacies aren't destroyed by one decision or one leak. They're undone when the truth no longer needs amplification. When it simply exists, undeniable, woven into the record, and once a story reaches that point, it no longer belongs to the person who lived it. It belongs to history. The final realization comes quietly, almost unnoticed at first. It arrives not with a breaking alert or a viral clip, but with acceptance. The understanding that the story has moved beyond reaction and into record. That whatever happens next won't be about surprise, it will be about confirmation. By this point, the public isn't waiting for drama anymore. They're waiting for closure. Not because curiosity is gone, but because the emotional arc has already completed itself. Minds have shifted, opinions have settled. The question is no longer what if it's what now. And this is where time becomes the most powerful force of all. Time exposes patterns. Time validates instincts. Time strips away spin and leaves only what holds up under scrutiny. What once felt confusing starts to feel inevitable. People look back and recognize the warning signs they overlooked, the moments that didn't sit right, the silence that should have spoken louder. This is the stage where history hardens, where stories stop evolving and start crystallizing, where narratives are no longer negotiated, only remembered. And the harsh truth is that history doesn't care about intentions, only outcomes. For the audience, this becomes something bigger than one person. It becomes a lesson about power, protection, and the cost of unchecked influence. It becomes proof that systems may move slowly, but they do move. And when they do, they leave very little room for revision. There's no satisfaction in moments like this. No celebration, just a sobering clarity, a recognition that cultural moments are fragile, and legacies are not guaranteed by success, only by integrity over time. Eventually, attention shifts elsewhere, as it always does. New headlines, new faces, new controversies. But this story won't disappear. It will live on in references, in documentaries, in conversations that begin with "remember when," not as a rumor, but as a marker. Because some stories don't need a final chapter written out loud. They end the moment the world stops arguing and starts understanding. The turning point doesn't arrive with noise. It arrives with realization. The moment when everyone's supporters, critics, observers, understands that the story has crossed a line it can't uncross. Not because of one release, or one voice, or one decision, but because the direction is now fixed. Forward. Unstoppable. This is the point where denial quietly exits the room, where even the most loyal defenders stop asking for explanations and start preparing for outcomes. You can feel it in the tone of conversations, in the way questions are framed, in how certainty replaces debate. The narrative no longer needs fuel. It's moving on its own. What makes this moment so powerful is that nothing new has to happen for everything to change. The pieces are already in place, the context has already been set. All that remains is sequence, and sequence is unforgiving. People who've watched stories like this unfold say the turning point is when power realizes it can't rewind perception. That influence can delay, but not erase. That once the public accepts a version of reality, it becomes the foundation for everything that follows: decisions, consequences, history. This is when the emotional weight truly hits. Not panic, not outrage, but grief. Grief for a legacy that will never be viewed the same way again. Grief for a version of the future that quietly disappears. And grief for the realization that control was never as permanent as it felt. Behind the scenes, this is when strategies shift from defense to containment. When the goal is no longer to win the narrative, but to survive it, to minimize damage, to endure what's already set in motion. That shift alone tells you everything you need to know. And for the audience, this becomes the moment of clarity. When curiosity turns into understanding, when speculation turns into acceptance, when the story stops feeling like it's unfolding and starts feeling like it's concluding, even if the final chapter hasn't been written yet, because turning points aren't defined by what happens next. They're defined by what can no longer be undone. And once that line is crossed, the story doesn't ask permission to end. It ends when the truth finishes speaking.